Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this third video conference for SAARC countries. And today we'll discuss a very important topic of the diagnostic. We know tests have been a challenge and there are different forms of tests. And to tell us of our experience at AIIMS and overall of India, we have Professor Lalit Dar with us, who is in charge of the COVID-19 lab here and is part of the several task force which have been formulating guidelines through ICMR and our ministry. So over to Lalit for your presentation on the diagnostics of SARS-CoV-2.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be with you today. We will be discussing the laboratory diagnostics for SARS coronavirus 2. This is an activity which started for us on the 2nd of February. So we've been into it for a little more than 3 months now, with many challenges that came our way. Right from the start. I think some of the first samples that came to us were from evacuees from Wuhan, and there were 2 labs which were testing these samples at that time. One is the Apex lab of the Indian Council of Medical Research, the National Institute of Virology, and the other was our lab. There were huge numbers which were coming in at that time, and I think all of us who have been involved in laboratory testing have been facing numbers. It's been a continuous challenge trying to meet logistics requirements, turnaround times, etc. So without further delay, I will move into the presentation. So we all know this virus by now. Most of us, we know that this virus has a single-stranded positive sense RNA genome, which is surrounded by a nucleocapsid, and outside that there is the membrane and the envelope, and finally protruding from the surface of this virus there are these spike antigens. The nucleocapsid is quite conserved between coronaviruses. The spikes are the ones which actually bind to the receptors, and therefore they have a good amount of variation genetically, and are also quite specific for each of the coronaviruses. If you look at the genome, there are about 30,000 base pairs in it, and these 30,000 bases will encode for they have open reading frames 1A and 1B, and it also encodes for some subgenomic RNAs, as well as individual antigens which we've already mentioned: the envelope, the spike, the membrane, and the nucleocapsid antigens. So where are we testing in India? We have a network of laboratories. Where we started from was actually what is known as the Indian Council of Medical Research's Viral Research and Diagnostic Laboratory Network, or VRDL network. This network initially had 106 laboratories. First, we started with 13 of these labs, which were at the regional level. And along with us, the National Center for Disease Control, the NCDC, was also testing. So 14 labs started testing first. This was in January itself that this was initiated. And now there are a number of government laboratories, government medical colleges, private laboratories have also been roped in. And of these laboratories, now there are 332 government laboratories doing the testing and 121 private laboratories. Among the government laboratories and private laboratories, most of them are doing the real-time PCR, the real-time RT-PCR. And this RRT PCR is the traditional PCR, but we also have few laboratories, 48, which are doing this rapid test, which is a molecular test again, which is again based on real-time PCR, but it's a point of care or near point of care test, which is an Indian one called TrueNat, and there is the other one called CBNat, which is essentially on platforms like GeneXpert. So we have 29 labs even doing that. And what has happened is that now this total number has gone to 453, and India is still trying to increase this number further. The CBNat tests were already being done for tuberculosis, and therefore these machines have now been incorporated into the COVID testing. And the real-time PCRs were already set up in many of these labs already for testing for influenza or for other viruses, and these have also been appropriated for the same purpose. Until today, or rather until the 7th of May, there have been 1.35 million tests conducted across the country, of which 52,952 have turned positive. And there have been 1,783 deaths as per the Government of India statistics available to us. What do we test? We have to choose the clinical samples that we test. In India, we test a combination of nasal swabs and throat swabs. So we basically take a deep nasal swab, which goes into both the nasal cavities and is rotated there, held there for about 15 to 20 seconds. And after that, these nasal swabs are added to a viral transport medium. And we also take a separate throat swab, which goes into the oropharynx and is taken reasonably vigorously and then added to the same medium. These swabs are made of Dacron, nylon, rayon, or polyester, which is suitable for PCR as well as for virus culture, which is the reason why we are using viral transport medium. The other option, of course, and possibly a safer option if you are going out into the field, etc., is to directly add these samples to some kind of lysis buffer, and some of these are available commercially also. The other samples which can be used and are being used in various places include nasopharyngeal swabs or aspirates, sputum samples, particularly from those who have lower respiratory involvement, endotracheal aspirates, bronchoalveolar lavages, although bronchoalveolar samples are few and far because bronchoscopy, not too many people are actually doing bronchoscopy as of now in these patients because of the high risk. Saliva samples have been shown in some studies to be equally effective. There have also been studies which have shown self-collected nasal swabs are good. PCs also carries the virus, but it's not very useful. It's not very frequently used for diagnosis because the virus may be shed in those samples for long periods of time, but it's not really very valuable in the acute phase of the infection. Blood samples can be collected, and these blood samples can be used for basically serological testing, which we will discuss later. In blood, otherwise you don't expect the virus to be there very frequently. It's a very, very low chance there's a very low chance of actually detecting the virus by real-time PCR in a blood sample. Why we use nasal and throat swabs is that this combination, in fact, there are many studies which have shown that nasal swab contains the maximum amount of virus. And if you combine it with throat swab, that's considered a good combination. A lot of countries are using this combination. Other countries are also, like the US is just doing nasal swabbing. The UK is using a combination of these. So various countries are doing different things, but we find that this is quite all right and it works well. When do you test? So there's this issue of early versus late stage of infection, and the basic thing is that if you are looking for acute infection, it is good to test early. Previously, it was believed that because this is this is the second SARS coronavirus, it was presumed that its pattern of shedding will be similar to that of the first one. Interestingly, it doesn't seem to be like that. It is similar to influenza, which means the previous SARS virus was reached peak shedding around 7 to 10 days when the person had severe manifestations. In this virus, like influenza, the virus is maximum in the early stages. In fact, there are studies which have shown that even in the pre-symptomatic stage, couple of days before the symptoms appear, virus is present in these individuals. and therefore it peaks quite early. And in the first week, you expect the viral load to start going down. And by the end of the first week, say around the 8th day, there are studies which have shown that there is less amount of virus in the sample. You may continue to detect RNA by real-time PCR, and there are some studies which suggest that this is due to dead virus and not viable virus. Of course, like everything in coronavirus, we are still learning. But essentially, you can the PCRs have been positive right up to 37 days in some people. There is evidence to show, and this is where the if you compare the upper and lower respiratory tract infections, those who have severe infections continue to shed the virus all through, even right up to, if they are say on ventilatory support, right up to the end. So if they succumb to the infection, they keep shedding the virus till that point of time. Virus, which is the virus, if it has infected the lower respiratory tract, you find that the virus is no longer detectable in the upper respiratory tract, and over a period of time, you will start seeing that it becomes, the sputum becomes positive for the virus rather than the upper respiratory tract specimens. So this is the kind of pattern we see. So, and I have already mentioned about the duration and the various samples in which you can detect it. It can be detected, as I said, in throats, in the upper respiratory tract specimens up to 37 days. In the feces also, it has been shown to be there for 5 weeks, etc. So there are studies for that, but it does not have too much of clinical implication because mostly you would like to diagnose acute infection. Whom are we testing? So in India, we need to have a good balance between testing asymptomatics, mild infections, and severe disease. So the Indian guidelines, as you can see, the ones I'm showing right now are the fourth version of the guidelines. These have been revised, and just like everything in Corona, there have been, there's been a lot of rethinking and a lot of sort of a dynamically evolving scenario, which all of us are reacting to as more and more information comes out. In the initial stages in India, the transmission was primarily from people who were returning from abroad. And these people had thermal screening at the airports. They had to give a declaration at the airport that they will be available for follow-up and for surveillance purposes, and that if they turn symptomatic, they will report to a healthcare facility. So the first group which was tested was symptomatic individuals who had taken international travel in the 14 days prior to them turning symptomatic. But this category is no longer important because the country has been in lockdown for many weeks now, and flights are not coming in except for specific chartered flights to bring in evacuees, etc. So this really doesn't matter except for those people who are being evacuated, who are taken to specific facilities where they are kept, and at that time they are tested right at the start, and then again before sending them back into the community and sending them home, they are tested at 14 days, and if they turn negative twice, they are sent home. The other important category, of course, is all the symptomatic contacts of laboratory confirmed cases. The third one is all symptomatic healthcare workers, because that is a community which needs to be protected, and India has been taking special care of the healthcare workers so that you can give them the confidence to continue working under the circumstances in which they have to under pressure, so that they feel comfortable that they are being tested when they require it, and that if they have any doubts about any infection that comes up, that they get an accurate result and know that whether they have COVID or not. If they have, of course, they would be sent into isolation for a couple of weeks, which is the policy everywhere these days, I think. All patients with severe acute respiratory illness are being tested. So fever and cough or shortness of breath are the criteria, and or shortness of breath. And asymptomatics are only tested if they are direct and high-risk contacts of a confirmed case. And the criteria for high risk are that you have unprotected contact for 15 minutes at least with a confirmed case within a distance of 1 meter. So these people are tested once between day 5 and 14 of their coming in contact. And this is essentially for contact tracing purposes. If they come positive, and why we have taken day 5 is that that's the median incubation period of this infection. In addition to this, ILI, that is influenza-like illness, which is essentially mild symptomatic illness with fever, cough, sore throat, runny nose, etc., is being tested in the hotspots or clusters which are defined by the Ministry of Health, or when there are large migration gatherings where migrants have moved from one place to another, or evacuees have collected at the centers, have been isolated at the centers. So in these scenarios, even mild ILI is tested. There is also a special provision for pregnant women, which was added a little later on 20th of April, and this is that pregnant women residing in cluster or containment areas or in large migration gatherings or evacuee centers from hotspots who present in labor or are likely to labor within the next 5 days are tested, even if they are asymptomatic. Why are we testing is important, and that determines also which test should be used. And diagnosis of acute cases versus serosurveillance is an issue which crops up. So if you are trying to diagnose acute cases, one thing is very clear that the best test is the reverse transcription real-time PCR or RRT-PCR. And this is done after viral extraction. The target genes vary between kits and between protocols. Some look at the E gene, some at the spike, some at the nucleocapsid, ORF1 and RDRP. All those who work in the labs are aware that there are limitations in the laboratories right now in terms of supply, and you don't always get a chance to work with the same kits every time. So these may keep changing. We initially used the E gene, which the kit was from National Institute of Virology, and they supplied us. They actually supplied all the 13 labs with a sort of assembled kit, so that we could take off immediately on and start testing. This had E as the kind of screening assay, so we used to test for E first, and if something came out positive with E, it was reconfirmed with ORF1b and with the RDRP gene targets. So for acute cases, this is still the strategy in India. This will tell you about current infection, but if you're doing serosurveillance or looking for past infection, we don't know whether these antibody tests will pick up just the evidence of past infection or whether they actually indicate an immune response. That's still not very clear, and there are more studies coming in. But if you're looking for past infection, that is the only situation in which serology could have a role. We don't advise in India testing using serological kits, looking for antibodies in acute cases at all. Some kits were procured, they were tried out. They have issues. The ones which we had were basically the rapid ones, point of care tests, lateral flow. And they had issues both of sensitivity and specificity, as well as variation in lots within the lot itself. So they are not being used right now. Antigen tests could help, but we don't have them available in India right now. Now the other issue is whether we are going to use an open platform or closed platform. There are open platforms available for real-time PCR as well as for serology. The US FDA has approved some kits which are for open platforms using ELISAs. There are kits which have been approved for open, real-time PCRs to be done on any instrument. And there are the closed platforms from all the major players which are also available both for real-time PCR as well as for serology, which are those high throughput platforms with either looking for the RNA or looking for antibodies. So these options are both available. The advantages of open platforms are that you are not dependent on one company or one manufacturer to provide you the consumables. You can move from one to the other. The advantage of closed platforms are if you can get a real commitment from them and you have high numbers, they may be able to supply you an end-to-end solution. And these have to be balanced. However, it has to be a judicious decision with probably balancing both these, availability of both these types of platforms within a given country. The other point, of course, we've discussed is whether we should do lab-based testing or point-of-care testing. It all depends on the location. If you have a place which is remote and you can't set up a full lab there with the right level of expertise, you can go for a point of care test, which is basically we have already discussed the CBNAT, etc. Those kind of platforms are there, which are being used mostly for tuberculosis already. And you can, but the limitation with that is the throughput. With every instrument, if you may have 4 slots or so with every instrument, you would be able to achieve a throughput of about 8 to 20, which means you have to have multiple modules if you have to scale up. On other platforms, the open ones, the lab-based platforms, mostly you can run batches of around 48 to 96 samples at a go. So this speed is great in point of care if you're doing small numbers. Possibly the throughput and speed is better if you are doing large numbers with laboratory-based platforms. How do we test? What precautions do we take? How do we go about it? How do we so the basic steps at which there is a risk to the healthcare personnel is when you are collecting samples. In the laboratory context, I mean, in the context of laboratory testing, is when you are actually collecting samples, or when you process a sample, which is in a medium in which the virus is viable. So for sample collection, we recommend appropriate personal protective equipment, and one has to take all care during that time. Sample transport is in a triple layered pack with biohazard indicated, etc. Sample processing, it is a BSL-2 pathogen. It's not a BSL-3 pathogen. So we take all BSL-2 precautions. We process the samples in a biosafety cabinet class 2A with full PPE. Including a mask, N95 or equivalent mask, and a face shield. After that, once you have added the lysis buffer and the virus is lysed, then you can go ahead and work in your regular BSL-2 areas. Disinfection of work area surfaces is important, and 70% alcohol-based disinfectants or 0.5% sodium hypochlorite can be used. And we follow waste disposal guidelines of the Government of India as per the rules with appropriate segregation and handling. This actually shows the first set of primers and probes that we received through the Indian Council of Medical Researchers Network, since we are a regional laboratory for them. These were sent by the Apex Laboratory, which is the National Institute of Virology, Pune in India. And we received this by the end of January, as did 13 other labs, as I mentioned earlier. And we used these initially, but now mostly most labs have also switched to commercial kits depending on availability from the manufacturers. And about 21 kits have been validated and approved by ICMR, including 10 Indian manufactured kits. And this is in addition to that, CBNAT and TrueNAT, which are the rapid platforms, low throughput platforms, have also been approved by the Indian Council of Medical Research for testing. What do we do with the test report? It actually goes to multiple places because this virus is this infection is a notifiable disease under the Epidemic Prevention Act in India. The COVID-19 patients or suspects get the report, the treating doctor gets the report, the Indian Council of Medical Research, and the Integrated Disease Surveillance Program of the Government of India, which is run by the National Center for Disease Control, gets the report also every day for contact tracing purposes and for isolation purposes. We also assure quality of the testing, and we have of course, all of us use kit internal controls, the positive and negative controls in each run. For every sample, an internal control is used, which may be RNAsP, or depending on the kit, it would be one of the housekeeping genes, which tells you that the sample adequate amount of sample was collected, there is enough cellular material, and that you are able to detect it after extraction. So that runs in parallel in most of these in these tests. And in addition to this, we have external quality assurance. We have panels going from the Apex lab downwards down the chain for testing, and we also have a system for reverse external quality assurance, meaning that every lab sends at regular intervals 5 positive and 5 negative samples up the chain for confirmation. Some of the laboratories, at least in the private sector, the government insists that they should be accredited, because these kind of external quality assurance procedures may not be in place unless they are accredited. And so there's the National Accreditation Board for Testing and Calibration Laboratories, or NABL in India, which accredits the labs based on the ISO 15189 standard. Finally, I will close. We have a wonderful issue of the Indian Journal of Medical Research, which also covers a lot of laboratory aspects on India and the COVID-19 response. This is an open access journal available at the website mentioned below. And we have published much of what I've talked about laboratory preparedness for SARS in India, how we've gone about it, how the virus was isolated from our samples at the National Institute of Virology, and genomic analysis of the Indian strains is also available on site. Thank you so much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Lalit, for your very lucid and comprehensive coverage. I know it's a very large topic and difficult to cover in this, but first of all, let me thank you for working day in, day out in this very difficult situation. I know your lab is working 24/7 and so are you.
Thank you.
We've received some questions which you've partly covered, but just for the greater clarity, what is the role of you talked about the cartridge-based nucleic acid amplification test, and there's been a lot of interest among SAARC countries to acquire this because it's been challenging to do the other tests.
Yes.
Could you just
tell
us the pros and cons of this?
So the real pros of this test is that it's quite user friendly because and you can use it in areas where you don't expect too much of throughput, where you expect about 8 to 20 samples a day. It should not be a problem with a single platform, or you can have multiple platforms of the same. There are Indian companies which are manufacturing it, which have been sort of approved by the Indian Council of Medical Research. There's a platform called TrueNat, which is a purely homegrown platform. We have been using it also for tuberculosis diagnosis, and there are publications which have shown that it works as well as the existing CBNAT, which the WHO has recommended. And of course, there's CBNAT, which everybody is aware of. I don't know whether we should be naming brands here, but I guess it's all right because all of us know it's a WHO recommendation, the GeneXpert platform, GeneXpert Express, which is now for which they are now providing cartridges for COVID-19 also. So the advantages is when at the speed of so if you have a point of care or near point of care situation where you need immediate results, maybe in emergency situations or where you don't have access to the larger platforms or technical expertise for the larger platforms, these have a role to play for sure.
The other question keeps coming is about the sensitivity of the RT-PCR. It varies,
yes,
in reports. So would it depend on viral load, stage of disease? You just
yeah. So there are some misconceptions in terms of sensitivity. The issue is that a lot depends on the samples you've taken. If you look at some of those publications which say that the sensitivity is lower, there may be ones in which the samples were collected a little late, and as I told you, the virus actually peaks possibly in the pre-symptomatic stage 2 days before the person turns symptomatic, and in the early stage of the disease. So the earlier you collect the sample, the more the chances of picking up the virus. And so when a person comes to you with symptoms, even if it's on the first day, you do expect a good amount of virus to be there. If you look at the analytical sensitivity of these PCRs, they would definitely be somewhere between 100 to 1,000 copies, whatever you're using. Even if it is one of the rapid platforms, I'm sure that they have this kind of sensitivity. At least for other viruses, they have shown this kind of sensitivity. So, and what is the viral load in these people? It can be anywhere between 10 to the power 4 copies per ml to 10 to the power 8 copies per ml. So, really speaking, there's a very remote chance that you'll miss anything, provided you've taken a good sample, and the nasal and throat swab combination seems to work very well because the maximum amount of virus is in the nose.
And that's also an interesting thing which
in acute stage,
we've been doing both nasal and oropharyngeal, which is not done normally.
This is a practice we've been following for influenza. So, a lot of lessons were learned when the influenza A H1N1 pandemic, which was later on not called a pandemic, but we had a lot of cases coming in. So we've been using the same strategies, and those same labs are already equipped. All they had to do was to switch to a newer set of primers and probes.
If you have any questions for the attendees, you can also unmute and ask the questions. Meanwhile, there's another question on the status of the rapid RT-PCR tests, which are apparently now available and in use in the Western countries. how good are they, and is there any chance of?
Yeah, so the really rapid ones, I know that there are some companies, in the US, for example, they're using one of the Abbott platforms, which gives results within within 15 minutes for sure, but maybe even shorter. Unfortunately, I think the demand in the Western world is huge. And therefore, most of those platforms are actually not making it to our shores. And I think most of the SAARC countries would be facing a similar issue about getting the new platforms across, because there's so much demand in the Western world that doesn't reach us, which is why we have to look for local solutions.
Another question for Anand for you is, and it's made news after been quoted by our director, who said that the peak is probably going to come in the influenza season of June and July. What is your view on that?
I think the main reason for that probably maybe because still cases are on the rise. As you can see in the last couple of days, there has been a gradual increase, and now we are seeing almost 3,000 to 3,500 up to 4,000 cases per day. And about 2 weeks back, this was 1,000 cases per day. So it is on the rise. Until we have a kind of a stability at the top, we will not really be able to say when we get a peak and when we reach the plateau. So right now it is on the upstroke. So the other countries, they usually had their peak, say, after about 2 months or so after the first case came about in many countries, and then they of course implemented their measures. So by 2 or 3 months. So maybe we started a bit late, probably. The peak started a bit late. So maybe based on those and the models that are being made everywhere, probably this statement and this kind of anticipation has come about.
I think we've been able to delay the peak primarily because of early lockdown and some of the strategies.
Yes.
That probably gave us a little more time to prepare.
Yes.
But it's at the end of the day, you are just deferring it, and it will eventually, you expect,
it will come sometime or the other.
There's a question, Lalit, for you, by your Academy of Paramedical Nursing Academy. They ask you, there's something about the isothermal amplification test.
Yes. Yes, tests like the LAMP, etc., which are isothermal, have been used in loop amplification mediated methods. The only problem is that they are not freely available on a commercial basis. They have, in the initial stages, they also had some issues with specificity because there was some amount of false positivity. They would be available in research mode, I guess, in many of our countries in the SAARC region also, because a lot of people have been working with them. We do have some labs which are working with them in India. But when you start thinking of high throughput, possibly they may not be the best solution. But if you are looking at smaller numbers, they would be worth trying out because they are an indigenous solution and they are possible.
And one more thing, of course, you've covered on the antibody test, but it's been highly controversial, and it's evolving knowledge on it, and even other countries have had very varying experience. So as of today, what do you think? It can be only for serosurveillance, or can we
until we get better tests? I'm not even so sure about whether one can use it reliably for serosurveillance, the ones that are currently available in our country. I know that the FDA has given emergency use approval to a number of tests, and it's increasing every day, because this question is before us right now and has to be answered at some point of time. What percentage of our population is infected, or in any given area is infected, because that will give you an idea about where we are right now and where we are headed. So it is required, and the US FDA at least has been giving EUAs for kits, and especially the larger platforms are claiming very good sensitivity and specificity, the closed ones, with ELISA, high throughput ELISAs. So let us see. I think ELISA may be better than the rapid ones as of now.
If there are any questions, yeah, Niranjan, you wanted to ask a question. Please go ahead.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, Lalaki sir.
Good morning. Yeah.
Am I audible, sir?
Very much, very audible.
Yeah, sir. My question is, how much DNA was used for native barcoding SARS-CoV-2 ONT protocol?
Sorry, your voice broke in between.
Sir, my question is, how much DNA was
Yeah.
used for native barcoding SARS-CoV-2 ONT protocol?
Well, we have not followed this. If you have used it, would you be able to give me some details of this?
Sir, may I write this question, sir?
Yeah, no, what is the context in which you are asking this is what I'm trying to understand.
We got your
My
question.
context is,
I mean, because essentially, in the context of lab diagnostics,
yes, sir. Context of lab diagnosis, sir.
yeah. So what implications do you think this has?
Sorry,
And why
sir.
DNA? What
Sir.
context? Yeah, I mean, what implications would this have? Because you're talking of DNA, not RNA.
Yes, sir. It's DNA, sir.
Yeah. So what is the context?
Context is, sir.
Huh.
Sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, please, we can hear you.
Sir, context is that, so I have seen varies to country to countries varies. Some of the experts giving the different answers, or some of the experts is giving the different answers. But I want to know that what is the ONT protocol, sir?
My area of expertise. We are diagnostic virologists. So really speaking, I can't understand how it's going to impinge upon routine diagnostic virology.
Okay. Okay. Sir, my second question is, hello, sir, am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
Yeah, my second question is, as cases are increasing, asymptomatic patient will be home quarantined. Is there need to track D-dimer in them? We have heard in rare cases there can be sudden death from pulmonary embolism or cardiac stroke even in asymptomatic patient.
And other prognostic markers, predictive markers can be used. There have been enough studies on that, but the point is whether you should use them in asymptomatics. I'm not very convinced because
Anand, you can also take that.
Anand,
but
I agree.
Short figure, this is a little oversold. This sudden death thing. I don't think if you look at the literature, it is there. Most of the asymptomatic people, and you need to monitor them all the time. Anand, you like?
Yeah.
Sir, one Delhi police Amit Kumar died suddenly. So within 2 days he had died. There were no symptoms. And this type of cases are everywhere. In Indore, one police person died in time of discharge. So, sir, therefore I'm asking you, sir, no number of cases is increasing in asymptomatic. Sir.
So again, the thing is that, sorry.
See, it is very difficult to call asymptomatic cases.
Yeah, so basically, see, again, the number of critical patients because of this is less than 5% actually. So they are the one highest at risk. To screen the entire 85 to 90% of other people who are positive at this point of time, and it is not as though D-dimer is something which is absolutely the gold standard. So that is why number of markers are there. But whether it is cost effective, whether it is in the public health system, it is possible, is really not sure as of now, because the proportion of patients is so low compared to the total number.
Yeah, I mean, there have been odd cases, but largely these are just anecdotes.
The other question is, of course, when are you going to look at these asymptomatics, and how frequently are you going to monitor them? Because they are asymptomatic at the end of the day, and the incubation period is 14 days. So how many times within those 14 days, while they may be in incubation, are you going to actually test them and do all these tests? So really speaking, it's logistically doesn't seem very promising.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ambush, can I ask one question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, my question is, sir, that can we unmask asymptomatic patients by doing 6 minutes walk test or some exercise and then use pulse oximetry? Because just to be see that whether they come into low risk or in intermediate risk or in high risk.
No, again, I think that would also be not. I don't think that is required. Also, what are we hoping to achieve by screening asymptomatic contact or patients by 6 minutes? We can just, they may be having many other diseases or many other problems by which they can be a dyspneic, or they may not be able to do the 6 minute walk test. So I think that again would be again practically also difficult. And at the end of the day, how would that help in prognosticating? I'm not very sure, because
see, we have actually there are studies where asymptomatics have been followed up and they remain asymptomatic. They have the same amount of virus as the symptomatics, but they remain asymptomatic also. Many of them do.
Thank
and
you.
I think Anant has followed them up at the National Cancer Institute, where some of these are admitted, and about 45% of them, I think, remain asymptomatic throughout the course of their stay. These were contacts.
There is one more question, if you allow me, sir. There is now, people are doing like for pre-op patients, screening PCR test all over the country, many centers. So what is the strict guidelines about this? Because we have gone through the ICMR guidelines and AIMS guidelines. So what should be the strategy for such patients?
The guidelines are quite explicit on this. They don't recommend, as I said, the only scenario in my presentation also I showed you, the only scenarios in which asymptomatics are to be tested are when they are high risk contacts, and I defined the high risk contacts also. The only other scenario, high risk contacts of a known positive case. The other scenario where asymptomatics can be tested are pregnant women who come for delivery 5 days, from 5 days
that
before
also
planned
from
delivery.
clusters where
And that too is only from clusters. So really speaking, even from the hotspots without symptoms, there is no recommendation. It is only for ILI cases with mild symptoms that you can test from the clusters. So yeah, there's and I don't think, again, the same reason. How often are you going to screen these asymptomatics? Supposing I screen them today before they get into the hospital, supposing. And once they come in, they can they may be in the incubation period, or they may be even before pre-symptomatic. After 3 days, 4 days, they may turn positive, despite the negative test at the start. That is the risk of screening asymptomatics, and then you're giving a false sense of security. A false sense of security where people will not be that careful
Sir,
with their.
Sir, can you allow me? May I ask you one question, sir?
just one sec, Niranjan. Dr. Rasoli, you wanted to ask a question before Bishop, then Niranjan can. Yeah.
Sir,
can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes, I'm Dr. Rasoli speaking, Ministry of Health. Though I am not a lab expert, I'm an epidemiologist. One of the challenges that our National Influenza Center, which is performing the COVID-19 test, is a shortage of RNA extraction kits. Though we have number of amplification kits, but we have a shortage of RNA kits. So how we can approach in the SARC countries, because only 2 companies, according to our lab, can meet our PCR machine requirements, RNA extraction kits. So how we should approach in the SARC country, particularly India, that is more compatible with our PCR. It's a ABI 7500 machines. So can you guide us? I can link to the lab.
Yeah. We, all of us are facing similar problems these days. So in that sense, most of us are looking at these problems every day. The ABI 7500, of course, is the real-time PCR machine. And as you rightly said, that is not where the shortage lies. The shortage lies primarily in the extraction kits, or even in the sample collection kits. So the thing is, extraction, there are 2 ways, as you might be aware, though you said you're not a lab person, there are 2 ways to do it. One is the automated method and the other is the manual method. Manual, traditionally, with certain chemicals, etc., there are, I mean, Protease K, GITC, etc. There are protocols which are there, which in the old days when we started out in molecular biology and virology, we used to use those chemicals and do the extraction without any commercial help. The problem is that those have been forgotten. So one of the ways is to try and revive that. But the thing is, in manual, there'll always be a limitation because you can't do very high throughput. I have people who, and of course, there are these manual, commercially available cartridges and magnetic bead-based separation-based tests. The cartridges are basically silica-based. So all these options are there. So if you're dependent on a closed platform, the supplies could be very difficult. But there are a lot of options available in the manual methods. And what you basically need to do is you'll have to at some point probably switch to the manuals. Now, what is the limitation there? As I said, you need more people to do it. One person, I have some experts who are very good at it, who have very good hand. They can do about 25 or so at the max in 1 hour. The average ones will be able to do anywhere between 15 to 20. So you'll have to have more people sitting there and doing the extractions. These are solutions which we will possibly need to look at as we go along.
Okay. Thank you very much. If you allow me, only one other questions about, though it's already mentioned about false negative cases. We have witness of some case of false negative, particularly in healthcare workers. So, as the presenter mentioned that usually in the early stage of the illness, there is chance of high load of virus. So, if we collect the samples in the later stage, so the probability of detecting the virus is low. So can you elaborate a little bit more?
So that is one reason that you may have collected it late, but the other reason usually in healthcare workers is the exact opposite of that, which means that the healthcare worker would come to you mostly when they have a history of suspected exposure, and they would come to you at a time when they are asymptomatic. So there you have to be very careful. I have had a couple of people coming in on day 2, day 3 who turn out negative. And then when you reach the median incubation period of 5 days or so, because they are asymptomatic, the symptomatic ones will get picked up right from the start, from day 1. But the asymptomatic ones, a good time to start testing is only at day 5. The first test should not be before day 5 of the last contact, because that is the median incubation period and you are more likely to pick it up. If you do it earlier, you might miss out some of those.
Okay, and sorry, and one of can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Rasuli.
One of your sample strategy is to recommend for all contacts, particularly high risk contacts of confirmed cases, we need to collect samples from day 5 to 14. So what is the rationale behind this?
Not day 5 to 14. You can test them any day between day 5 and day 14, depending on convenience. Okay. If you pick them up at day 5, it's because that would be, the earlier the better to try and pick them up, but before day 5 is not a good idea. That was the intent of that. And day 14, because the incubation period, the limit is day 14.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Sir, may I ask one question, sir?
Yeah, Niranjan.
Ambuj, can I ask one question?
After Niranjan.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, my question is, I am from Nepal. I am working here last 22 years, and I'm an Indian man. So my question is to Guleria sir. Till now, there is no specific treatment or vaccine for COVID-19. Do you think this task takes more than normal life? Number one, sir. Number two, I have seen one interview of Guleria sir yesterday evening in News 24. Sir was telling that so it's come June or July is very high. So after that we are very much panic, sir. because we all Nepalese are looking to India. So what India is doing and what India is telling. So we are very much panic. So what is it? How long we will have to live in this lockdown, sir?
Okay, so the first part of the question I could not understand about vaccines. What were you asking? How long it will take to build a
No,
vaccine?
my question, first part is, sir, till now there is no specific treatment or vaccine for COVID-19. So do you think this task takes more than normal time?
So development of a vaccine does take, it is not just the process, it is also the entire process of testing, trials, safety, efficacy, and everything else. So not less than 1 year, I would say, if you go by the normal process, even if one tries to fast track the regulatory processes, still it will take several months to do so. So that is part one. And the part two about yesterday's statement, again, I think the premise on which that was made was that India as a country started a little late peaking because of the early lockdown, maybe. So the peak has been kind of delayed by a month or so, month and a half. If you see the most of the European and the American countries, they started ascending from, say, February onwards. So from January, February till April or so, they have reached their peak. But we started off in end of March and now in the entire April. So probably 2 to 3 months is the time where other countries have taken to peak. We are still on the ascent. So we are still, the number of cases are kind of increasing. At least they are not plateauing or decreasing. Based on that and some models that were made, it is thought that probably it may take up to June for that stage to occur.
That is also the peak flu season.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, I think that is probably one reason that it's the peak flu season. But to come to the latter part of your question about the lockdown, that will depend. I think increasingly now the feeling is that the lockdowns will have to be opened at some point, and they will have to be opened in a very guarded manner. Those specific hotspots will have to still be in lockdown, and it will keep changing from time to time. And otherwise, areas which are not that where the transmission is not that high will probably be opened up. So I don't think you'll be in lockdown all through June, July, August, September. That all you will have to take as you go along.
Quick question,
Sir.
Is that
Thank you, sir.
Ambuj,
being positive
can
even after 18 and 19? Would you like to take that?
Yeah, in fact, that's a good point. The thing is, there are studies which have shown that after day 8 in symptomatic people, most of the virus that you find is non-viable. You find basically RNA being detected, and there are a couple of studies which have shown that. CDC has also now, I think, brought out a document just a day or two back, where they say that after day 7, the virus actually is not viable virus. You are picking up the RNA. And so we need to interpret it in that light and not worry too much about it, because if it is not viable virus, it is not likely to spread.
It may not be possible to do the cultures, which is
the cultures. Yes, so these studies which have come out are to do with culture. Right now,
it won't be, for a person to decide whether to discharge.
In an individual, no. I would not say so, but maybe more studies are required by culture and real-time PCR compared over a period of time. And those will be coming out, I'm sure, from various parts of the world. The thing is that the virus has to be cultured under BSL-3 conditions. So, you have to have those facilities. You don't want it to spread and unnecessarily.
But clinically, Anand, if somebody is coming positive, I don't think you can discharge him. Still keep him on quarantine because
under quarantine, yes, that quarantine, whether it is institutional or whether it is at home, that may depend very much on the patient profile, his symptoms, and his ability to quarantine himself or isolate himself at home from the others.
But we are looking at that possibility already, both at ICMR and in the Ministry of Health. Based on the existing data, whether we can take a call on
early
discharging them early based on clinical recovery
without testing again.
Yeah.
Rishabh, you wanted to ask some questions?
One was, I think, already answered about the, there is a prolonged stay of patients. They are coming positive, and we all know, as sir has said about the Korean study, that it is because of the dead virus. So one is the policy thing, which I think is being discussed. Second is the status of the HCQ in the management, because of recent evidence, whether we should continue with this or sir is trying to change or modify some ICMR guidelines later on.
I think just today we have that HCQ paper in New England Journal where this is again an observational study which did not show any benefit but did not show any harm too. It was a propensity matched study and to not a randomized controlled trial. The patients in the HCQ who had taken were sicker patients also, so they adjusted for that. So there was no additional harm, but they did not show benefits. Obviously, HCQ is something which is evolving.
I think as of now it is where it is actually. So the guidelines by ICMR still recommend HCQS as a chemoprophylaxis in some selected patients, people, and as a treatment in the moderately to severe. But again, that is not robust evidence based. That is all based on these observational non-randomized trials which are there because of, I think, the kind of the urgency of the situation. Probably this has been done because there is no other treatment actually available.
The other question is one we've been asked on social media. One is, should cancer patients are susceptible? Should all of them be screened? How do you?
No, again, no, not all of them. Again, there are guidelines for oncology treatment in this particular situation by various societies, and I can quote at least for chemotherapy. So all of them do not need to be screened, but yes, all of them are in the high risk category. So if they are positive, they go into the high risk category and do whatever has to be done based on that. But if they are not positive and if they're asymptomatic, everybody doesn't need to be screened unless symptomatic. Treatment also can be given except for the fact that they do say you can kind of postpone chemotherapy for a couple of weeks if it is not going to make too much changes into the clinical status. So that they have given some kind of guideline based on the duration of chemotherapy and the interval.
One question I think is a difficult one. How do we judge and differentiate antibody detection in a recovered patient versus an asymptomatic patient? Young people may not have symptoms.
Yeah, well, if you see, the first thing is that it's not that difficult really. If you do the tests in parallel, and you have, first of all, the prerequisite is you need to have a good antibody test. As of now, we are still searching for that really, and maybe some answers will come down the line. But if you have a good antibody test and you find that the IgG type of antibodies are present, IgM is negative, and the real-time PCR is negative, then you presume that this person has had infection in the past and recovered from it.
But even there was this concept of passport, immunity passport was floated. Then there was that people who have antibody positive may still not be immune.
So now the other question is, the first thing is that you had the infection and recovered from it. The second thing is whether you have now become immune to subsequent infections. Those are two different things.
Yeah.
The antibodies may be present. We are still not sure whether the antibody test will tell us that this person is now protected against the virus, because protection is another ball game altogether.
Actually, there was a question yesterday. Somebody was asking, so maybe I'll ask you here that how, suppose one has got the disease and recovered again, what is the likelihood of getting a relapse or reinfection? Plus, is there any chance of this virus mutating and being infected by another strain?
Well, viruses keep evolving, and RNA viruses are particularly prone to higher rates of mutation. So that possibility cannot be ruled out. The other thing is, how long are people protected? Now, we don't know, but in general for coronaviruses, there is some evidence to show that people may be protected not for a very long time, maybe for 6 months to a couple of years. Lifelong protection is not one of the scenarios we see in coronavirus.
That was one misconception that some people had, that once when you get this IgG and all those things, you are protected for life and all those things. So they are not, they are myths, they are not facts.
I don't think that is likely. Of course, we'll find out only later. But from what we know of other coronaviruses, it doesn't seem very likely. The same problem will be if you get immunized. My gut feeling is that the vaccine will also protect you for a short duration. So it will be like getting an annual
vaccine.
Yeah, something along those lines. Just hope that it is effective. That's all.
Yeah.
One last before we wind up, Dr. Lalit, again, is about use of saliva for testing.
Yes. So there is a study which has shown that saliva works, but the protocol in that was a little cumbersome. It spoke about a person who was suspected a suspected COVID case sitting for about half an hour, spitting into a container. I thought it had biorisk as well as, it's a very cumbersome way. It is possible that saliva may work without all those things. We possibly need more studies. So yeah, self-collected nasal swabs are another thing which people have used, which could be a convenient method. So
Collection is a bit risky.
Collection of saliva would be
risky.
Risky if you're doing it in a container. If you do it with a swab and it works, well,
That's a different matter.
Yeah.
I think if there are no more questions, we'll quit here. Thank you all for joining in today, and thanks to Lalit Anand for taking time out. I know from your busy schedule.
Thank you
Thank you
for
very
being here with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.